Hello, I'm Sam Amon, and this is the second episode of The Art of Asymmetrical Warfare. Since this month is Anglo-Irish War that followed to be a man's game. And this perception comes from who wrote the histories, as well as the participants' own efforts to come to terms with what had happened between 1916 and 1923. But it's furthest from the truth. There were plenty of women who fought during Easter Rising, served as couriers, as spies, as secretaries, as nurses who took care of the men, who cooked, who mended their uniforms, and who afterwards pushed for prisoner release and prison reform, who created funds for the families who had been affected by the Rising, and this effort continues into the Anglo-Irish War. R.F. Foster's book, Vivid Faces, does a great job explaining how revolutionary Ireland truly was during this period and how there was this huge feminist movement that was growing and led by people like Kathleen Clarke and Hanna Sheehy-Skeffington. And you had giants like Constance Markievicz, who was leading the way for women's rights. And that all ends like 1920s once the Free Irish State Government is formed, and then with Cosgrave's administration, and then Eamon de Valera dictates it further. So there is also this great letdown for everyone in Ireland, but particularly for the female members of the IRA and Tom Naban, which was the female auxiliary unit, and Sinn Féin. You cannot talk about the women of Easter Rising or even the women of the Anglo-Irish War without first talking about the force of nature that is Constance Markievicz. Constance was born into an Anglo-Irish family, and she was sister of Ava Gorboof, who was another Irish rebel. She wanted to be an artist when she was younger, so she went to Paris to study, and when she was in Paris, she met this Polish guy who was originally from Ukraine named Kazimierz Markievicz, and somehow, one way or another, he adopted the title Count, and so when she married him, she became Countess Markievicz, although she seems to have hated that name. She preferred Madam. They returned to Dublin in the early 1900s, and that's really where she becomes committed to politics and to helping the poor and those who were struggling. And she makes a huge splash when she enters politics. She joins Sinn Féin in 1909. She joins the Daughters of Ireland. She helps found Tom Naban. She is arrested in 1911 for protesting King George's visit to Ireland. She joins the women suffragists, protesting against Churchill's election to Parliament during the Manchester Northwest by-election, and Churchill loses that election, and historians have given the suffragists credit for that. She co-founds the Fana Irene with Bulmer Hobson in 1909, which is basically a boys' scout group teaching boys how to shoot. And then in 1913, she provides food for the workers and families who were involved in the Union strike, which is now known as the 1913 lockout. And that's a huge moment for her because that's where she meets Jim Larkin and James Connolly, who will then create the Irish Citizen Army. And the Irish Citizen Army is a paramilitary group dedicated to fighting for workers' rights. And so they see Irish nationalism and Irish republicanism connected to this bitter struggle for socialism and freeing the workers. And so she becomes very involved with the Irish Citizen Army. It seems that Connolly trusts her to a certain extent. She becomes an officer within the army, and that's why she's fighting in Easter Rising. She joins Michael Mallon's unit at St. Stephen's, which is the south side of Dublin. And when she's there, one of the first things she does is that she ends up killing a police officer, and it makes a huge impact on everyone around her, and also it seems to be a defining moment for her as well, because she still remembers it long after Easter Rising. They fight at Stephen's Green for Monday and Tuesday, and then Tuesday they're pushed out, and finally Wednesday they have to retreat to the Royal College of Surgeons, where she hides out for the rest of the Rising, and she takes pot shots at British soldiers, so she becomes like a semi-sniper. When they surrender, she is taken to Kilmainham jail, and she is the only woman to be put on trial and sentenced for execution. Her sentence is later commuted to life imprisonment because she was a woman, and the British drew a line at executing women. However, there is some controversy about her trial, because if you read certain historians, they really try to play up how hysterical she was, and there was kind of like this rumor that she actually asked to be spared because she was a woman. And I think a lot of that comes out of, again, this kind of sexist narrative that developed around Easter Rising and around the IRA, where, you know, women didn't have a place, or women's place was in the background, right? Because that was also the narrative that emerged after the Civil War and after Ireland becomes a nation. But I also think it comes out of Constance herself. Constance, it seems like you either loved her or you hated her. There's really no middle ground with her, and she made a number of enemies during her lifetime. But I don't think, even if she does, you know, even if she did break down in trial, I don't think it takes away from her courage or bravery at all, especially since after she's released from jail, she immediately joins the cause again. She becomes a Sinn Féin member. She's the first woman to be elected to British Parliament, but because Sinn Féin had the rule where you wouldn't sit in British Parliament because it's an illegitimate body, she never takes her seat. I read somewhere that there's a portrait of her, though, in Parliament, which is interesting to me. But she's the first woman to be elected to Parliament. She is the first woman to be part of a European cabinet. When the first sale is convened, she becomes the Minister of Labour. And then during the war, she's arrested a number of times. She ends up serving 5 terms in jail. During the Irish Civil War, she is heavily anti-treaty, and she is arrested, thrown in jail again, and then she goes on hunger strike, and she was released a month later, which is kind of interesting when one considers what happened to some of the other prisoners during the Irish Civil War. After the Civil War, she joins Eamon de Veria's new political party. So after the Civil War, Eamon de Veria is still Sinn Féin, but he's being pushed out, and he doesn't agree with their parliamentary absenteeism because now they're boycotting the Irish Parliament. And so what's happening is that Cosgrave's administration basically has no serious opposition, and Eamon de Veria wants to get back into politics. So he creates his own party, which is Fianna Fáil, and Constance joins that party and runs for election and wins in 1926, but she dies in 1927 before she can take her seat. Constance is a complicated woman who seems to have lived a very complicated and challenging life. Because she dedicates herself to the Irish cause, she has a very strained relationship with her husband, who at some point actually returns to Ukraine for a while, and then he comes back because he's with her when she dies, and her relationship with her daughter is very difficult because she left her daughter basically with her parents, so she had to go fight for Ireland. And I think she had a hard time too adjusting to Ireland after the Irish Civil War. And then all of her time in prison and fighting also took a toll on her body, and that's why she dies so young. I think she's in her 50s when she dies. So she is a very inspiring figure, but I think she's also a very complicated figure, and that also colors some of the narrative that developed around her after the conflict. This woman should be a giant in the Irish history. If there's any justice, she would be as big as Michael Collins or Eamon de Veria. I am of course talking about Kathleen Clarke. Kathleen was born into a prominent Fenian family. Her uncle had served time in the same jail that Tom Clarke served time in. Her uncle, when he was released, brought Tom Clarke home and introduced him to Kathleen, who was about 20 years younger than Clarke. Kathleen sometimes is overshadowed by her husband, I think, because her husband planned Easter Rising and he died during Easter Rising. He was executed for being one of its leaders, and he recreated the IRB, and he has this history of being a very, rabid Fenian. He was arrested for the dynamite campaign, I think in 1878. But Kathleen is just as radical as her husband and just as important. One of the reasons why Kathleen wasn't with her husband during Easter Rising was because Tom told her to stay behind and help rebuild the IRB in case Easter Rising failed. And that's exactly what she did. She was arrested briefly, but she was released. And after she was released, she established the Irish Volunteers Dependence Fund, which provided financial support to the widows and children left behind after Easter Rising. She worked with others to rebuild the IRB and help create the IRA. She also threw her support behind Sinn Féin and supported Eamon de Veria as president of Sinn Féin. During the Rising, she lost her husband, Tom Clarke, her brother, Ned Daly, who was also executed, and one of their closest friends, Sean Matiamarta. She had also been pregnant with a child, and she didn't tell Tom this when she saw him one last time in jail, but after the Rising, she would lose that child. Kathleen was elected to the second sale. She wanted to run during the first sale, which is when Constance Markievicz ran and Winifred Carney, but she was given a seat that would be impossible to win. She was anti-treaty, and she was arrested a number of times. She became a founding member of Fianna Fáil. She became the first Lord Mayor of Dublin. She served as a district judge on the Republican courts in Dublin during the Anglo-Irish War. She was against the Constitution of Ireland because it placed women in a lower position than had been afforded in the original proclamation of the Irish Republic, which peers had read during Easter Rising. She left Fianna Fáil after they refused to ask for clemency for the IRA members who bombed England during World War II. She helped found the Irish Red Cross. She was constantly fighting for women's rights. She never forgot her feminist roots. So she's just this huge pillar, I think, for womanhood and womankind in Ireland. And as a feminist, she should be an icon for people around the world. She's definitely someone worth knowing and worth researching. She's a different kind of Irish rebel. She's not like Constance, where she fought during Easter Rising, but her contribution may even be more important because she was there to pick up the pieces after the Rising failed. She held herself together after she lost, her brother and her husband and her best friend, and she thought about those who were also going to be affected by the Rising in ways that the men didn't. So that's why she created the Irish Volunteer Defence Fund. And she kept to her principles after the war, and she never forgot that Ireland would never truly be free unless the women in Ireland were free. Another woman who should be associated with Easter Rising is Maria Winifred Carney. Carney was born in Bangor and grew up in Belfast. She was born to a lower middle class family. Her father was Protestant, her mother was Catholic, and her father left them when she was very young. She became the first woman in Belfast to qualify as a secretary and shorthand typist, and this enabled her to get involved with the Irish Textile Workers Union in Belfast, and that's where she meets James Connolly and Jim Larkin, and she becomes very involved with the socialist movement and the workers' rights movement. She and Connolly hit it off very well, and in 1912 she becomes his personal secretary, and they kind of become inseparable. And I think there is a narrative that has developed that she was just a hero-worshipping secretary who, thought her boss did do no wrong. But judging from Connolly's papers and her papers, their relationship was far more equal than that. He made her an escort for members of his family. He asked for her personally to show up at Easter Rising, which she does. She arrives with a Webley revolver and a typewriter, and she's known as the typist with the Webley revolver, which I think is maybe one of the coolest names ever. And she sits with him in the General Post Office throughout the entire Rising. So when they're being bombarded, she's there typing out orders. When the city's catching on fire, she's there taking care of a wounded Connolly. When Pierce and Connolly tell her to run because the building's unstable, she stays by their side and she's one of the last people to leave along with Pierce and Connolly. When they surrender, she's still there by Connolly's side. And when he was executed, she was devastated. She serves her time in Mountjoy. She's released in Christmas 1916, and along with Constance Markievicz, she is one of the only women to run for election in 1918, and that's because both the British and Sinn Féin were trying to figure out, should we let women run this time around? Do they have the right to vote? Can they stand for election? And so once they made that decision, a number of women didn't even bother because they were given seats that were going to be impossible to win. So Constance wins her seat, becomes the first woman elected to British Parliament, but Winifred loses her seat. And after that, she does what she can to support the Anglo-Irish War, and then the Civil War happens, and she's anti-treaty, and she's arrested several times. But after that war, she loses faith in politics, and she goes back up to Belfast, and she works with the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. While working there, she meets a man named George McBride, who was a Protestant and who fought in the British Army during the Somme, which again highlights this overlooked fact that many nationalist Irishmen fought in the war because they felt it was right, but then when they came back, they either remained loyal to England or they actually joined the IRA. So it's a facet that should be explored a little further. So she marries him, and when she marries him, she loses a number of friends and family members, and he loses a number of friends and family members, but they make it work, and they stay together until 1943 when she dies. And they fight for socialism and workers' rights together. And after she dies, McBride never remarries. Winifred is a perfect example of a woman who would easily get overlooked because, she carried a gun, but she didn't fire. She didn't shoot anyone. She didn't kill anyone. Even during the Anglo-Irish War, she wasn't this bigger-than-life figure like Constance Markievicz, and she didn't have the name of a famous Irish rebel like Kathleen Clarke. But her position was just as important, and her contribution was just as important because she was literally writing out all of the orders that Pierce and Connolly were trying to give to the units, and she was able to provide care to James Connolly, who was one of the Rising's leaders. So her impact is easier to brush aside, but that doesn't make it any less important. The next woman we're going to discuss is as much a victim of Easter Rising as she is a strong Irish rebel and feminist. Hanna Sheehy-Skeffington was born to a strong Fenian family. Her father was actually an MP for the Irish Parliamentary Party. Her family was close to James Joyce, who introduced her to Francis Skeffington, her future husband. They would marry in 1903 at University Chapel in St. Stephen's Green, and they took each other's name to symbolize their respect for one another. So Hanna's name is Sheehy and Francis's name is Skeffington. Together, they fought for Irish nationalism and Irish independence, as well as women's rights. And Frances was a pacifist, but Hanna seemed to be a bit more the firecracker in the family. She was arrested in 1912 for smashing the windows of Dublin Castle, which was the center of authority for the British in Ireland, and she spent a few months in jail for that. She was arrested again for trying to present leaflets to Bonar Law and Edward Carson, and she assaulted a police officer, apparently, during that attempt. Again, she went to jail. She went on hunger strike for 5 days and was released, where she helped found the Irish Women's Franchise League, which was a militant group that fought for Ireland's independence and to include women's rights in the Home Rule Bill, because Hanna felt that the Home Rule Bill didn't do enough for Irish women. And it would become the largest suffragette group in Ireland in the early 20th century. She provided food to workers during the 1930 lockout, and it was heavily inspired by James Connolly. She was fiercely opposed to the First World War, as was her husband. But I think, unfortunately, what she is most known for is actually the death of her husband. During Easter Rising, Hanna did not fight, but she provided care and food to the men when she could. And Francis was a pacifist, so he didn't believe in violence, but he also tried to help any way he could. And he gets picked up by a British officer, Captain Bowen Colhurst, and he's taken to jail, and Hanna doesn't know. And 2 other Irishmen are arrested and thrown in jail with Francis. And then later that, I think this was like the Thursday of the Rising, so like one more day and Pierce would surrender. And for whatever reason, Colhurst takes the 3 out of prison and brings them into a courtyard and shoots them. And then he tries to hide the fact that he shot them. And so Francis doesn't come home, obviously, and Hanna starts to get worried. So she and her daughter, they go to the local prison, and they ask around because maybe he just got picked up because, it's a mess right now in Ireland during the Rising, and the British deny knowing anything about him. And so she asks for a couple days, and then I think eventually someone tells her what actually happened, and then she pushes for an inquiry. And it probably wouldn't have gone anywhere if another British officer, Francis Van, had not also asked for an inquiry. So eventually the British give in, and they find out that Colhurst was, they claim that he's insane, and they allow him to disappear and live in Canada. So no real justice for poor Hanna or Francis. After the Easter Rising, she tours the U.S. to talk about her husband's death and to talk about the Irish cause and women's rights. And while she is there, she becomes Ireland's representative to the League for Small and Subject Nationalities. And she publishes Britain Militarism as I Have Known It, which is banned in the UK. When she returns to Ireland, she's forced to go through the UK, where she's arrested. She's eventually released. She goes back to the US and to participate in the Irish Race Convention in New York, which is again another convention to fight for Irish rights. She eventually returns to Ireland. She becomes an executive of Sinn Féin, and then during the Irish Civil War, she's anti-treaty, and then when that ends and Eamon de Valera creates Fianna Fáil, she becomes an executive of Fianna Fáil. She becomes an editor on Flobosh, a journal of the Irish Republican Army. In 1933, she's the one that's arrested for going into Northern Ireland. There had been a ban banning her from Northern Ireland. When she went on trial, she said that she did not recognize partition, so she didn't recognize the ban. And she went to jail for a few months before being released. She launched the Irish Citizen, a newspaper founded to further the cause of women's suffrage and feminism. Hanna, like Kathleen Clarke, should be a bigger figure in Irish history than she is. I think she's another giant that gets overlooked and overshadowed. Again, her contribution to Easter Rising is not the violent, which fight with the boys. But I think her presence is felt, and her contribution to the greater fight for Irish independence and women's rights should be acknowledged. The next woman we're going to discuss actually has more to do with the preparation for the Rising than the Rising itself. Her name was Molly Osgood, also known as Molly Childers, and she was the wife of Erskine Childers, who was a British writer who believed in Irish nationalism. Molly Osgood was born to a Boston family, and she was born disabled at a young age, and she could never walk without her crutches as she grew older. She met Erskine Childers in 1903, and they were married in 1904 at Trinity College in Boston. And she became a member of the Committee for Relief in Belgium, and was a trustee of the Irish White Cross, where Erskine was also an executive committee member. And that's kind of what brought her to Europe during the time of the Rising. Molly and Erskine were in charge of a small group of nationalists, purchasing about 1,500 Mauser rifles and 49,000 rounds of ammunition from a German company. And they were planning to take the weapons and bring it to Ireland. So the British knew this was happening, but Molly and Erskine spread rumors that the weapons were being brought in through fishing boats. So while the British are running around trying to find these fishing boats, Molly and Erskine take the boat off the coast of Wales with the weapons on the boat, and they sail from Wales to Ireland. And when they land, hundreds of Irish volunteers were waiting for them to help unload as quickly as possible. The British find out and they send a number of policemen to stop them, but they're too late. As the rebels are disappearing, the citizens throw rotten fruit at the police, who open fire, and the skirmish is known as the Bachelor's Walk Massacre. As can be imagined, the success was huge. You know, the Irish volunteers were incredibly proud. The Childers couple were incredibly proud that they were able to pull this off, and it does make a difference, I think, in terms of how long the Easter Rising lasts. Molly wasn't there at Easter Rising, but she does support her husband during the Anglo-Irish War. And then in the Irish Civil War, they're anti-treatites, and Childers become enemy number one for the Cosgrave government for reasons that we won't get into in this podcast. And so when he is captured, he is executed because he had a revolver on him, and it turns out that the revolver was the one that Michael Collins gave him. And the Cosgrave government had passed a law that if you were carrying a weapon, you'd be singled out for execution. So he's executed, and Molly has to survive on her own. And so what she does is that she joins the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, one of the world's oldest peace organizations, and later that will merge with UNESCO of the United Nations. And then their son, actually, Erskine Hamilton Childers, will be Ireland's fourth president. So again, Molly is a perfect example of someone that you could easily overlook. Right? I think Erskine does get a lot of the credit for the Haworth gun smuggling episode. Her presence and her contribution was just as vital as her husband, and she's one of those women who also suffered, I think, the most from the Easter Rising and from the Anglo-Irish War and the Irish Civil War, because her husband, again, was on the run, he was arrested, and then later he's killed by his own fellow rebels. So again, a perfect example of a contribution that could be overlooked if you really wanted to, but shouldn't, because it was just as vital as anyone else's contribution. As can be seen from this episode, the idea that women didn't participate in Easter Rising and beyond is ridiculous. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you'll come back. If you enjoyed this episode, please go into our website, www.samswarroom.com, where you can find supplementary material, book reviews, and a transcript of this podcast. Thank you, and look forward to discussing asymmetrical warfare with you another time.